We have a fabulous panel.
Up, right?
It's going to warm us up. Riveting stuff. So I'm James. I work at Consensus. I lead global public relations, and I do a lot of writing. And I work closely with some of the people here on this panel. But I thought it would make sense for us to do a round of introductions. So, Sophia, could you please tell the audience what you do, what you work on, and what you had for breakfast this morning?
Okay. Hi, I'm Sophia Lopez. I'm one of the founders of Kaleido, which is a blockchain business cloud. It's a consensus business. We launched about a year and 2 months ago. We have about 2,000 client networks running on Kaleido today. In my prior role, I actually led IBM's blockchain platform portfolio, so I grew that business and had both the open source mission as well as a commercialization. Built three generations of platforms there, and then came to Consensus and built a new one from the ground up on enterprise Ethereum. Although we're multi-protocol, multi-cloud, flexibility and choice has always have been our motto. So really looking at rapidly helping clients, radically simplifying the adoption of blockchain so people can accelerate getting from POC to pilot to production.
That was nice. Shall I go? Yeah. Okay. My name is York Rhodes, and I co-founded our blockchain work at Microsoft. I got into this, sort of the Microsoft journey is basically my journey. In 2015, when Ethereum launched into beta, I started reading about computer science terminology I hadn't seen since college, and wondered why it was all of a sudden like popping up in threads that I was reading. So I started reading, and I spent about 6 months going down the rabbit hole. And I had just returned to Microsoft 6 months prior to that in a partner-facing role, which was what I sought to do when I returned to Microsoft. And so it kind of faced a pivotal point where I had to decide, am I going to stay at Microsoft and build this business inside of a 120,000 person organization that knows nothing about blockchain? Or am I going to do the easy thing and go somewhere that knows something about blockchain? So I decided, it was actually a hard decision for me to return to Microsoft, and so I decided that I was going to go the hard road and convince Microsoft that this was the right thing to do. And so we've had a pretty, what I would say is a wildly successful journey over the last 3.5 years, approximately, in building our credibility in the space. And some thanks, obviously, to Consensus, who was our first partner in the blockchain space. I met Joe and Andrew and about 3 other people who were the total of Consensus in 2015. So it was 5 people at the time, and has survived miraculous growth to where it is today. So we're predominantly Microsoft today. If you don't know the Microsoft of today, is a cloud provider. So we look at enabling enterprise and startups to build on top of the infrastructure and the software that we provide. We are wholly embracing open source, which is particularly important in blockchain. And from a Microsoft perspective, our model of being a cloud provider actually enables us to do that. It's quite symbiotic, because if you're running open source software in our cloud, you have to pay for the compute infrastructure. So this works quite well with enterprise as well as startups, and it's sort of a symbiotic relationship between the various communities. We are protocol agnostic to the point that it makes sense. You can imagine, and Sophie's going to have the same experience, is supporting multiple protocols is actually quite challenging from a resource and sort of up-to-date perspective. But it is important, I think, in the market to, at a point in time where we are in the market, to actually stay somewhat agnostic. While there are significant leaders, certainly in terms of traction, ecosystem, developer orientation, tooling, more advanced topics, and certainly Ethereum is in that category compared to the other top protocols that we see. What we look at from a cloud perspective to make those decisions is basically the telemetry about our customers who are actually using the different protocols. So we see Hyperledger and Corda, which is both 2 other open source protocols running on Azure, which is what our cloud is called, as sort of the most prominent today, and that might change in 2 years, right? So that's part of the reason why we have to sort of think about, what's the telemetry telling us about what's important. we'll get into some of the more, sort of the broader things that we're doing, but as a platform provider embracing open source, open source, anyone who's worked in open source, it usually has very rough edges. So enterprises don't know how to deal with rough edges. So we put a lot of tooling around the rough edges to make it accessible to enterprise. And when people ask me, like, why is Microsoft doing this, or why are you doing this? I usually basically say that we're leading the world across a chasm, and the role of Microsoft is to actually help enterprises cross that chasm. So.
Nice.
Thank you. Hope that warmed you all up.
So my name is Soulema. I'm the CEO and one of the founders of Komgo, a startup incorporated last year in Geneva. My background is banking, 18 years within the Société Générale French bank, SocGen. 9 past years in the commodities business. So I moved to Geneva 9 years ago to open the commodity department of the bank there. And as you may or may not know, this business is very much paper-based and hasn't changed in terms of ways of working over the past 100 years, I think. So with a bunch of passionate people, we met blockchain in 2016 and started to test it and see what it could bring in terms of added value to our industry. And following 2 very successful POCs, the bank asked me to move to production stage. They were kind of fed up with seeing POCs everywhere, and they really wanted this to happen. So I have been working on this company over the past 12 months, building a network of investors backing us. So we have 15 companies very close to the commodities industry who are shareholders of this startup today. So you have 10 banks representing 90% approximately of the liquidity in our market. The usual suspects, the French ones, the Dutch ones, and very international and big ones such as Citibank, MUFG, and Macquarie. And we also have corporates in our backing us as shareholders, which is kind of a unique setup. If you look at the different trade finance platforms, they are more or less usually built by banks. For me, it was very important to have this hybrid shareholding structure to build a solution for the industry. So we have been supported, and we are supported today by Shell, Gunvor, Mercuria, Coke, and SGS, which is the biggest TIC in our business. TIC meaning inspection company. So incorporation in August, I resigned from Société Générale in September, and we teamed up with Consensus in the course of last year, in May. Started working with Sophia and Steve in July. And after an amazing job done by the teams, we managed to go live in December. The first letter of credit was issued on the platform the 21st of December at 7 p.m. Big time for us. I mentioned this because it was a Friday evening, and at 7 p.m. just before Christmas, normally nobody's in the bank anymore, and the guys, they stayed and they just left after opening this first LC. So we have a really amazing support from our shareholders. And so now we're launching the business, onboarding the first users, and making this happen.
That's like the #1 thing of software deployments. Never deploy before a holiday.
I fully agree with you, but we really wanted this go live to happen last year for plenty of reasons, and we didn't give up.
That's great. Congratulations.
I think it actually says a lot to have these major banks. They normally go into freeze between Thanksgiving through the end of the year.
Yes.
So pushing into production in December shows how motivated people are to move forward with blockchain projects.
We had, I think, a community of 120 IT guys from all our shareholders. That I think you worked a lot with all of those guys.
Yeah, well, we had one of our guys in London for the whole week too to support. Yeah,
I know, and you're completely right. They were so excited by this project that they have adapted all their processes to make this happen. So they have done shortcuts in all directions. They have been available on a very short notice. It's completely amazing. Yeah, you're right.
Actually, I think it's an important point. Is most of the value proposition from blockchain comes from a network effect of participants who have like goals in some cases. So it's like, if you ever deployed software into an IT enterprise, doing it in one enterprise is a Herculean effort. Doing it across 10, 20 enterprises is quite challenging to corral and time the IT departments and all the exceptions that you have to get to production. So.
But we
I was going to actually ask a question about governance. So, but before we get there, perhaps you could describe Kaleido a little bit and sort of what Komgo is using in this consortium, and then also Soleima, from you, you've been doing this now for almost 3 years, or at least doing pilots. What's it like trying to convince some of your shareholders about the value of blockchain and why they should use Kaleido or something like that?
Yeah, maybe we'll let Soleima start with sort of the people side of this, the shareholder side.
There's a lot of hype around blockchain. So there's clearly all those big companies, they need to have blockchain, like they need to have CSR and they need to have all that kind of stuff somewhere in their communication. So that's one argument for them. Most of them are led by people who are very, very strong believers in new technologies. And who have pushed the organizations to move forward to changing all ways of working, definitely. Commodities business has been massively hit by additional regulations over the past years. So obviously, there's an issue in terms of profitability in the industry, and a strong conviction today that people cannot continue working like that. So there's a really important momentum in the industry to make this happen now. And I think the last point is kind of FOMO. Definitely. I mean, I have Shell as a shareholder. BP didn't join, so today I have BP on my back. Why is Shell there? And Total is saying the same thing, and they're kind of, we want to become shareholders, and they just don't want to be users. They also want to be shareholders because the other guys are in it, so that's important. And finally, I think there's a team effect, definitely. We have been carrying these projects over the past 3 years, and when you invest in such a company, you also invest on a team.
Mm-hmm.
I think Soleima touched upon an important point. Prior to running the blockchain platform portfolio, I actually ran the enterprise systems portfolio for IBM, which is multi-billion-dollar mainframe-based hardware software services. So you have a lot of the enterprises running core mission-critical systems on these platforms that have been around 30, 40 years. And although there's been a lot of transformation at sort of the web and e-commerce tier over the decades, it hasn't gotten into the systems of record. So you have these very siloed systems of record. Mm-hmm. And the sort of transformation we saw on a personal level, where we've moved from sending a photo through email to like 50 different people separately. Now we have a platform like Facebook. You send something once, and you can adjust the permissions, and the people who can see it, or supposed to see it, can see it. And so it's a very granular control, but you have sort of this platform to share artifacts. That never happened in business. You still have these point-to-point communications. So, business has been left behind, and you have now businesses looking to bring their relationships to the blockchain. They're looking to digitally transform decades-old systems. So if you look at supply chain, like EDI is decades old, payment rails, integration technologies like Message Broker and MQ. Used to be part of my portfolio. So really looking at what was going to happen next as enterprises really have this urgency. There's consumer expectations and demands and how you need to do business today. And sometimes things are still paper-based. They're point-to-point. They're really inefficient. They've been trying to bolt on analytics and other solutions on top. And now they're looking at AI and other IoT. And they just can't do that with the way their current business processes and infrastructure is set up. So that's why I added blockchain to the innovation part of the portfolio with cloud analytics, mobile security, and saying blockchain is really where enterprises are going to want to move. So started working there in 2015, and what saw working with hundreds of clients is there are really 3 main challenges adopting blockchain at enterprise level. The first challenge people were hitting was really at the core technology. Mm-hmm. So it's a distributed P2P network, heavily Dockerized. A lot of enterprises don't have those skills. Heavy crypto, new programming languages and frameworks. So just trying to get their arms around that meant they often just got stuck at the POC phase and had a lot of trouble finding skills. And then if they managed to get out of the POC and to a pilot, they really ran into, I think what Yorke and Soleima were touching upon, this concept of shared IT. So it's hard enough if you're running 1,000 applications in your data centers, Yorke alluded to get that extra 1,001st application up. And I think some people were initially thinking of, oh, it's just a blockchain application. It's another one we're going to stand up. Then they bumped into what we like to call shared IT. So now everyone controls their piece of the network, but no one controls the whole network. So how do you do something as simple as onboard a new member? And then you had some early consortiums. You had one participant maybe in the insurance industry, and they had done a pilot on blockchain, and they think, well, you can all join my network. You can use my app. And of course, that doesn't work. Everyone wants to join sort of a network of equals or consortium of equals, depending on the term they use. And you've seen some high-profile projects trying to get off the ground where it's been exactly that issue. For example, in a shipping industry, and you have a major player, no one wants to join that person's thing. They want to come in. So governance and how you set up. So I think how Komgo set up an independent entity, and it might be good if you talk a little bit more about that. So that's on the people side of things. From a technology, just the tools and workflow wasn't even built yet. So that's part of what Kaleido was looking to address when we initially launched. And then the third level of challenge is really around just enterprise. So marrying enterprise, getting into enterprise production, marrying the new problems of blockchain with just the traditional classic problems of running enterprise production systems. So scalability, reliability, security, performance, and then really this integrating into your existing systems and sources of data. So really looking at ways to make that as easy and familiar to people as possible. So one thing we've done towards the second half of the year, we launched a marketplace that really baked in some of the repeatable patterns of deployment we were seeing. And as part of that, we have an integration gateway, which uses Kafka messaging. So all enterprises have invested in Enterprise Service Bus. You have application developers who know how to talk back and forth in that format versus having them learn Ethereum-specific libraries. So looking at various areas, I could talk more about other things we've done, but I think that's sort of a summary of the enterprise journey, getting from POC to pilot to production, and how some considerations on how to make that journey a little faster. I will say, out of all of the blockchain networks and consortiums we worked with, I've never seen anyone go into production as quickly as Komgo did. Basically starting in July, and then by December, I mean, we had seen clients for years. And so thinking it would be months, spanning years, spending millions of dollars, thousands of lines of code, and getting stuck at a POC phase. And then radically scaling back what they wanted to do from a business perspective, just to try to get the blockchain piece of it to work, and to stand it up and keep it up and running. So that's what we were hoping to help people with, sort of take that layer and some of the associated blockchain services that run near the chain sort of off their plate, so people can focus on the business use case, ROI, and rapid iteration on that.
Elegant one-click blockchain.
Yes.
Yeah. They have an easy button. Yeah. So, Yorke, I'm interested in hearing from you. So, in the time that you started Microsoft at blockchain, you've probably seen a lot of pilots. And, whether it's Deloitte or I guess there's been recent reports saying a lot of pilots aren't actually moving into production. What have you been seeing people using Microsoft Azure for, and, some of the POCs that you think are more successful?
Yeah, so we started the journey, recognizing the same problems that Sophia mentioned around, it's just hard to deploy open source software in an enterprise. Cloud makes it easier, but you still need to put a lot of tooling around it. And so when we actually put that tooling around the stacks, we saw a lot of people now were able to spin up the stacks, and then they hit the next stopping block, which was, okay, now I have this nice command line interface into an enterprise system, and how do I connect it to SAP or connect it into my existing systems of record? And so they stopped, right? And so when we recognized that, then we started looking at, well, how do we help the enterprises take the next step? The reality is, like with any new technology, and this can be much more likened to like an internet technology than a new database in terms of its complexity. You're dealing with laggards and slow followers and fast followers and leaders, right? So, and certainly in the market, we're still in the 3 to 5% projects that are in the leader space, and that will happen for some time. So I think the critical thing to do really is to identify the projects that, with a little bit of assistance, will actually go to production more quickly. And so that's what we try to do in our team, actually, is really focus on those customers that have really done the right things to think about what does it mean to put a shared network with shared code and shared responsibilities into production. And in fact, some of the guidance that we give customers who are looking to stand up these networks, has nothing to do with code, right? It's like, how do you deal with shared governance? How do you think about this? What is, how do you actually put this technology to work? Cloud actually, from our perspective, our job is to make it as easy as possible to do this in our cloud. Fundamentally, blockchain is a distributed, decentralized technology, so we have no delusions that people want to do 100% of their work in our cloud. So all of the tooling we provide actually enables IP connectivity to any system. It can be other clouds, it can be on premises, and what have you. But we do see, I think, that people who are doing this in cloud, because of the ease of deploying enterprise systems in cloud, it actually can happen more quickly. There are lots of examples across industries of where people have gone to production. Microsoft as a company, and I worked at IBM also, earlier in the 2000s, tends to be much less aggressive in terms of PR. So our stance generally is, well, if it's not production, then we shouldn't be talking about it. And then we get pressure from our comms team and say, well, you got to talk about something, right? So we have some great examples. World Bank bond project is an example that I was pulled into. That project probably, it was a collaboration between World Bank and Commonwealth Bank of Australia for regulatory reasons, among other things. The bond was actually launched in the jurisdiction of Australia. This project actually was probably around for about 2 years before it got into production, at least 1.5 years. I know that the Commonwealth Bank of Australia had done some prior pilots before working with the World Bank, which is common, right? With an IT team, getting people comfortable with the technology, you need to do some pilots. And so what we did was basically work with the World Bank, where Azure is their preferred cloud. So we came in, knew that they wanted to go to production very quickly, and it's actually as a key point. The thing that drives people to production is an executive saying it has to be done on this date. If you don't have that executive, it's just never going to happen, right? So in the case of the World Bank, the treasurer, this wonderful woman from Nigeria, basically said, the date is July 31st. We are going into production on July 31st, and you better get ready. And so I got into the project in the late spring, specifically to help get to production in our cloud successfully, and to do the appropriate security infrastructure inside of the World Bank so that the treasury desktops could communicate with the cloud securely, and that the World Bank had a secure direct connection to CBA as the sole communication between those two organizations. And the only communication means you can't take shortcuts around knowing what else is going on, knowing about identities and things like that. So there are a lot of processes when you do that. In fact, this deployment is a hybrid deployment. It's a multi-cloud deployment. There are originally 5 investors was the plan. We wound up with 7 investors, so oversubscribed from an investment and a dollars perspective. They raised 110 million Australian dollars, which is about 80 million US dollars. And the blockchain technology, the infrastructure, is the sole record of this transaction. So if the blockchain dies, if the technology falls over, that will destroy the record of this transaction. So it's actually very explicitly done in that way, so that it's not a parallel system, which would look more like a pilot. And the treasurer is very clear that World Bank, as an institution, has an opportunity to help guide markets. And so part of doing this bond and the timing of this bond was market dynamics and the desire of the World Bank to essentially be the first company or organization to be able to say that they had done a bond registered as a digital asset on this technology called blockchain, and to go to market with others as well. So if you think about sort of the totality of an application like this, you've got back-end infrastructure. It happens to be running on Kubernetes. It's got DevOps deployment into the cloud from a GitHub repo depository with sign-offs on code that might change over time. And on the front end, you've got the treasurer at World Bank and the constituents there looking at the transactions as the bond is being settled and the pricing is being done, essentially the bidding for the positions within the bond from the investors. And then you have investors actually hitting a web page, to actually go do that bidding and participate in that. So if you think about that from an infrastructure and across IT perspective, it's relatively complex, full stack deployment across institutions that has to be 100% secure. So it's not an easy journey. You definitely want good partners when you go on that journey. So that's just one example. I mean, we've done actually some internal work as well. When I look at my part of my role at Microsoft is to continue to push the envelope on how Microsoft uses blockchain technology. So we've done some internal early work and some production work. We did a project in the Xbox team, which is our gaming platform. And that work was very specifically focused on royalty payments to our game providers. So whenever games from, say, Activision or Electronic Arts, or Fortnite or others, when they run on our platform, there's payments that go from our platform back to the game providers. Like any other supply chain, it's slow and laborious, right? So, typical payment terms are, 45 days before somebody gets paid, which is kind of senseless. So in that particular example, the technology is the foundation for expediting all of the, the processes and the paperwork associated with that. I think one other important point before I give up the floor here is, so what you'll see in a lot of these projects is very deliberate scoping effort toward what we're going to do and what we're going to prove in each phase of the project. And if you don't do that carefully, you can wind up in analysis paralysis or trying to achieve things that just would not be possible. In the World Bank example, Australia was specifically chosen because of very friendly regulators, knowing that this could be done with the regulators' support in Australia in that jurisdiction. It was also very deliberate for this phase of the project not to try to move money on the platform, so that trying to hit the July 31st date. And by the way, August 10th, I think, was actually when it went live. And the only reason it went live on August 10th was because the IT team at the World Bank said, no, we need more time. So that's usually the role of IT, is to push back on the executives' timelines. But I think often you will get criticized, or you'll see criticism in the market around, well, what did you actually do and why did you do it? I think the most important answer to that question is, if you don't scope things appropriately to achieve specific goals in a phased approach, you can't sort of cross this wide chasm in one leap. You have to actually take short leaps to get there.
Cool. So, test. Doesn't look like the mic's working, but I am curious about this question of governance. So, maybe theoretically you can talk about it, Sophia, but you also have a lot of different, you have 1,900 networks built, so there's some really interesting use cases that involve complex governance. But also I want to hear from you, Soleima. What's it like to have, these 10 banks on calls or in a boardroom? And maybe for the audience who doesn't think a lot about permission blockchains, what are some of the first things you need to do in terms of governance? Is it validating? Is it deciding who makes certain business decisions, who has more access to the network? Can you take us through that governance process?
That's a tough one. It's all about managing egos, I think, at the end of the day. Especially if you look at the shareholders we have.
Which are all wonderful.
No, they are, but they have very big egos. And when you put clients and banks in the same room, it's a tough one. It was a big challenge. How did we build this? Good question. I didn't really reflect on that, so I'm going to try to do it now. Governance. So we want this company to be able to take decisions and make things happen. And this cannot happen if you have a board of 15 people. It's as simple as that.
That's right.
And what I ideally wanted was a small board 3 to 5 people, not coming from any of the shareholding companies. This was my starting point. And I ended up with a board of 9, all coming from my shareholders. Which is, by the way, a beautiful one. So I'm not complaining at all here. We manage it quite well at the end of the day.
We'll make sure the shareholders don't catch this video.
No, but
I was thinking exactly that.
No, but they're really amazing. Yeah? They have big egos, but they're really amazing. This is not a joke.
She's not letting go of that.
So the founders of Komgo all had automatically a board seat. So the first 5 companies who decided to make this happen, ING, ABN AMRO, SocGen, Shell, and Mercuria automatically had a board seat. And then we offered 4 board seats to the new investors joining. And those were selected based on a vote. So it was there was kind of a lobbying process, and 4 were selected. And we have a beautiful board today because we have 2 French banks, 2 Dutch banks, 2 clients, and 2 very international and big banks, Citibank, MUFG, and Macquarie. So it's an amazing group of people. As a CEO, I do have a lot of autonomy. Not as much as I would have liked to have to be able to move fast, but when I need to move fast, they do answer, and they do answer to pressure, and they can be reactive, definitely. What is very important, so you mentioned this use case and selection process and phasing process. What they really want is that they really want to feel loved and to feel inside the company without being inside. So this means that we spend hours with all those guys, with all those users, with their communities. We have built a lot of users communities, and we're very much user-centric. So anyway, we need it to build a good product. So very important to give them that time, to give explanations, and to see them. Even if I have a board of 9, I'm seeing the 15 of them every month, basically. And that's very important to have people on board and with you. When I got the job, actually, somebody told me 50% of your time is going to be managing your shareholders, 50% is going to do PR communication, 50% is going to be building the vision of the company, and 50% is going to take care of your team. It's more or less what happens. I mean, especially when you have 15 shareholders. So yeah, very important to build this user community, to make them feel in the driving seat, even if they are not in the driving seat at the end of the day, because we are the ones making the decisions. Very important to keep kind of a distance and not to put all the decisions on the table, because if you do, after they just micromanage the company. So be very cautious about what you ask them to decide on. What else can I share? Next challenges, obviously. So we raised enough cash for the 18th first month, so I have started to work on my new fundraising. And I have a clause which is in my shareholder agreement saying that I'm supposed to resize the board. And governance is going to be a very big topic of this one, because we're going to be supported by additional strategic investors. Obviously, when you start discussing with them, the first question is, please confirm I'll have a seat on the board. So my first answer is no, you won't. Just be very clear here. But yeah, we have to be clever in terms of governance, because I think it was good to be backed by the shareholders' representatives to start. I think it was actually the best choice for the company, because it pushed us also inside the companies. But I think that for the scaling and the growth of the business, we should really get people who know how to do that. And I'm not sure bank representatives know how to scale a platform business. So it's going to be a tough topic this year, yeah, definitely.
I think we talk about the term consensus a lot in the blockchain space, and certainly from a technical foundation perspective, but from a governance perspective, every business decision is some form of consensus, right? And if you think about board votes, is it 100% consensus? Is it supermajority or majority, right? Those are all sort of governing frameworks around how do you decide what to do and what to do next.
And it was a big part of our discussions when we founded the company last year. We avoided we wanted to avoid actually any 100% decision-making process. I missed one, incredibly enough, but okay, I managed it. Yeah, but that's very important, yeah. Clear.
And Sophia, can you talk a little bit about, so I guess as a way of background, the public Ethereum mainnet uses currently proof of work, which is what Bitcoin uses. So you have all these computers doing complex math problems in order to validate the current state of the Bitcoin blockchain, and same with Ethereum. But with private permission blockchains, you can have different actors assign roles for validating essentially the history or the state of the entire network. So can you talk a little bit about, of people who are using Kaleido now, some of the tougher governance decisions they have when they're deciding, how are we going to create a shared business infrastructure, who's in charge of what? Because something you often talk about is not necessarily setting up the network. The hard part is changing the business logic or coming together as a larger consortium of businesses.
Okay, sure. I guess on the people side, just to add to some of Souleima's experience and what she shared, there's, I guess, I don't know if you call him a thought leader or researcher or academic, but John Cotter had done a lot of research on change management over the years and has written a ton of books. And one thing he says, it's interesting, 70% of organizational change management initiatives fail. That's just not even technology related, it's the people related. So he has about an 8-step process. And the very first one is you need a burning platform. You need to be on a burn. People need to be really motivated to get off and feeling like the heat and the pain of where they are. And then there's a lot of communication, getting stakeholder buy-in, executive sponsorship, and all of that. So I think one thing, probably some analysts or people who've been in the business process management space for a while just think, wow, it's going to be hard to get all these people together. And the benefit of blockchain is that network and that the use case across the parties and the collaboration. So I think just on the people side, what Komgo did differently than what I saw other earlier consortiums, and I alluded to this earlier, is just really setting up a separate entity and pulling really good people out of the different organizations who'd been involved with the pilots and establishing that, and they're all in, not just dipping a toe in the water, but still having their day job, because then you get a lot more partisan type decisions. And there's always going to be people, execs at their company who they still are beholden to, who are like, well, what are we going to get out of it? And you need to represent our point of view, versus being all in on, we've created this new entity and, giving that an identity. I think Komgo's done a great job on that. And it's sort of the branding and the mission and just, so that structure makes a huge difference. Guess there's a law in IT, Conway's law, that sort of like the structure of the teams reflects the output you're going to get. So if you have a 4-team, you're going to have a 4-pass compiler because everyone's building things that sort of align with the interests of their team. So I do think, although it seems maybe so simple, it does make, that makes a huge difference, just the initial setup of thinking about the consortium and how you approach it. And then having collaborative people. A lot of times when you have new technologies, you have people who are maybe more futurists, and if they think, this is career building for them personally. So if they're looking at what's going to help them personally, they're not thinking about what's best for the group, and then you also get the wrong dynamics. So the leadership is extremely, if you have a CEO who's focused on self-promotion and what their next step in the career is, they're going to make decisions which aren't as good for the network. So it's all these factors need to come together on the people side, which I guess not many surprises there. But on the technology side, I think it's interesting. I'm happy you brought up public versus private and some of the differences around consensus mechanisms. When you talk about decentralized and distributed in the public space, people think about miners and compute equipment. And I think it's really important to realize that in the private space, you have, a bank is not going to open their ledger to just anyone and have anonymous participation. So there's privacy and there's permissioning. So what's really decentralization and at that distributed trust in an enterprise setting? It's really having different members with voting and putting signatures on the blockchain, and they're distributing the control of the network, and they're helping maintain the integrity, but they have their own key materials, and now it's the signatures, and it's not so much about who's mining and in like the proof of work world. So I think sometimes it's hard for people in the public space to realize in enterprise it's really the distribution of control and decision making and sort of maintaining the integrity with those key stakeholders. You're going to have different tiers of members in a network. Obviously there's going to be just users who are accessing this on a browser, mobile app. You're going to have those core stakeholders who really want to maintain the integrity. They want the private keys. They're signing. They're probably going to be very interested in the protocol and the consensus mechanism. Definitely where private keys are and who has them and all of that is a very important topic to that group. And then there's another tier which they're participating in the blockchain, but they're not at that level of the stakeholders. So actually how we built our enterprise plans has two tiers, so working together in the networks, because they have to interoperate, and that's part of Komgo's business case is getting up to 1,200 potential addressable people who could benefit from this open financing platform. So the benefit of cloud-based approaches, it's very easy to elastically scale. In a minute you can spin up the new node, you have new people joining, and they could join at the level that's appropriate to them, sort of both in terms of control and responsibility in the network, benefits, and then the cost associated with that. So there's different levels that work together. In terms of the flexibility and choice I mentioned right in the beginning, with the consensus mechanisms with Go Ethereum, we have proof of authority, and we also have Raft and IBFT. So there are different trade-offs between the consensus mechanisms, between privacy, security, performance. And as you're experimenting on different use cases, it's great to click button, you can spin up a network, try different variants of the protocol and consensus and see what's the right one for your use case. I think in general, the last comment on governance, anything on the network is going to have a life cycle. There's change management. You want to know the smart contract you think is running the network really is. So building in ways that you can verify the smart contract code, which we've done, it's important because now you're moving these physical sort of artifacts you've done with lawyers into a digital representation, and you want to make sure it is what you think it is, and then track and audit all the changes. And then every step of the way, like the voting and sort of reaching that point where you've got the consensus from the network to move to the next step.
A couple of key points that you pointed out, which I think are pretty critical, is as we think about the transition from siloed IT environments, where everything's owned by one organization and the administrators control access to that, to a consortium blockchain or a private blockchain network, which is a bunch of parties coming together in a shared compute and a shared network environment, versus a public environment where the parties who are maintaining the public network are not known by deliberate design. And so we're in the middle with enterprises, and if you think about the chasm that's being crossed, it's actually sort of getting to enterprises comfortable with the concept of blockchain and shared compute and shared IT, with a goal that, like the internet, eventually we are performing business functions on the internet like we do today with e-commerce, for example, and complex stacks of technology that allow us to transact in ways that we didn't imagine when we were children, like, for example, ordering an Uber on a corner, right, is a very complex e-commerce transaction that happens over the internet, right? And so you have all these different technologies involved, and that's basically sort of the broadest place you can go in terms of the far edge of the chasm in terms of how we think about the internet. So the blockchain journey is very similar to that. So we're in this middle space where we have to maintain control of things because the enterprises need to have that control. And private keys in a blockchain scenario essentially represent your access to the system. So control of the private keys is essentially everything. If someone has your private key, then they can sign transactions as if they were you. Not only as if they were you as a person, but as a role on the network in decision-making processes, and as the organization. So key management is an area of sort of current focus, I think, because if you look at a lot of the POCs when we take them over, one of the biggest errors that people are making is where are those keys stored? Because this key management is complex, so people doing POCs take huge shortcuts, like putting passwords and usernames in code, or having private keys sitting on a VM, right? That's fairly open, so from a structure perspective, our guidance around architecture is we have these cloud-based key vaults. You can actually do real-time permissioning of private keys from the key vault on demand to basically keep those keys completely secured away from your admins who could get to that VM file, for example. And so, some of these, very complex technical frameworks are it's really plumbing, right? Who cares about that from a business process perspective? And then layer on top of that a multi-party workflow, right? Which is the real business value that you're getting out of this network, and what the code is there to support, and the signatures will then verify that you've actually made that particular decision. So this is not it's not a simple, technology journey by any means, but.
I will, last comment, we've definitely seen people start in the public and move towards realizing they can't put all the data and everything on the public mainnet. So they're moving to side chains and other layer 2 technologies. And in the private space where we've started, there's also movement towards public. As you know, as part of Kaleido, you can pin the hash of the state of the network periodically to the public network, just to prevent anti-collusion, because obviously that has thousands of nodes there. You might have a smaller public network, so that just records the state of the network, and it helps prevent, it helps ensure the immutability. So there's a convergence happening between the different approaches, and obviously a lot of interest in that area.
Yeah, and actually there's just one point about the public networks, which is very amorphous to a lot of people. The way that I've actually heard this described quite effectively from a technology perspective is that it's a distributed public key infrastructure. And that's different than how we think about certificate authorities today, and public key infrastructure today, which is all very siloed. And for example, I mentioned e-commerce earlier. Every single e-commerce transaction is basically secured by the same 1 or 2 companies. VeriSign, gives you the secure certificate that lets you tell consumers that that's an okay transaction and a place to do those transactions. In today's world, that's not very safe, right? We've certainly demonstrated that from a siloed IT perspective, we don't do that very well. You can look in the press at all of the breaches that happen on those networks. So,
or even the largest ever bank heist last year happened with the Bank of Bangladesh and the SWIFT network, which actually had people tunneling into what essentially was poor key management.
Yeah. Yeah.
I didn't mean to cut you off,
no,
but so I think it's just about 9 o'clock, but I did want to open it up to the floor, or to any questions anyone has, if you guys are interested. If not, they'll be around after, so you can talk to them on the side. But
yeah,
anyone have any questions?
If you're in the bleachers, feel free to ask a question also. Yeah, so good question. It's not just a Microsoft question. Certainly we have our point of view, and you can look at the investments that we've made, and sort of how we lead our investments to look at where we, put more emphasis. And certainly to date, that's been in the Ethereum space, for many reasons, some of which are that's kind of where we started. But any large enterprise is going to hedge their bets, and they're all doing that today. So you see a lot of people working with Hyperledger, Corda, different variants of Ethereum, which have different qualities as well. Specifically at Microsoft, we certainly believe in this concept of the open internet, and that we also think blockchain is going that direction. And so that gives you a certain perspective on what technologies have to be there in order to be successful. You can look at the future state of that today, and it's basically public blockchain networks, right? And how do public blockchain networks, how are they maintained, how are they secured, how are they distributed? And that's sort of future state. While the technologies today in the public network may have limitations on scale and obfuscation and things like that. Thank you for coming. That's just similar to the state of the internet in 1995, right? From a time perspective, if you lived through that, 95 was 5 years before the dot-com bust, right? And so we're kind of right there in terms of technology. So Microsoft specifically, we work with the open source communities. We contribute back to lots of different code bases. One of the things that we actually announced at DevCon, which is the Ethereum Developer Conference in the fall, was we wrote from the ground up a C++ EVM essentially capability that runs inside of a secure enclave. So we basically rewrote to the same, in a sort of a clean room environment, a C++ EVM It is specifically designed to run within a secure compute environment like Intel SGX or other technologies like that. And we contributed that to open source. So anybody can go grab that code base and go build a clean environment. We sort of stopped at the edge of some things in terms of that development, just from a scoping perspective. We had a very specific need to do that within an ABM. We didn't have a need to support necessarily public networks at the time, so that work hadn't been done yet. But it sort of varies. I would say the other area that we're very heavily involved in is, I mentioned earlier that a private key is your identity in blockchain, both public and private. It's just a critical piece of infrastructure. Microsoft, as an identity provider, has a 400-person team doing identity for 20 years. I wouldn't necessarily call it identity. I'd call it permissioning. So like the login services that you use to get into your network, probably 80% of the enterprises in the world, it's Active Directory on the back end. It's an LDAP compliant directory system. Doing this in sort of a blockchain-based scenario means you shouldn't have a single provider doing that. It shouldn't be siloed. There's a lot of distributed public key infrastructure nature to that. So we actually got together with Consensus and others in the blockchain ecosystem and said, hey, we need to think about standards and implementation standards in the identity space. So we co-founded the Decentralized Identity Foundation, which is focused on exactly this, right? Which is, how do we create a framework that lets all startups build to the same specifications on identity, so that if I'm sovereign and I create an identity, it can be read by UPort. Right. Yeah. So that's an area of, basically that work is 100% in the public domain. We have our team that actually just launched a beta of a version of that we're working on, basically based on those specifications in our products. And so where we're going is, we recognize that these siloed Active Directory infrastructure is a great place to start, but from a user-based perspective, but needs to migrate to this distributed public key infrastructure. So we're putting in place the building blocks for that, so that you can actually have essentially an Ethereum public key be represented in Active Directory, as one example, so that if I go to a corporation, I can bring my identity with me. So those are just some examples.
Yeah, I was going to add two quick adds. One is that I think from the question you said, Corda was enterprise versus Ethereum was public. I mean, there's also enterprise Ethereum, which you can use in private and permission networks as well. And I'd mentioned you can pin from that private implementation to public, if you'd like. Another thing I wanted to add just on the identity, we actually just, as part of this marketplace of additional services, we have an ID registry, and that helps with the organizational identity, and as well as in the product, you can use normal PKI X509 certificates to identify who your organization is. So you actually, on the Kaleido network, can go all the way through to your LDAP, which is great, because companies have invested millions of dollars in establishing that. They set up this new blockchain network, and then someone leaves, they want, just with a button, to be able to deactivate all their, and that flows through, is plumbed through all of their enterprise systems.
So, I mean, I think today there are plenty of problems that can be solved where that equation matches the technology. And that's where you see most products or most implementations actually working. And that's part of the scoping effort, is just to know that, from a, solving that full back to front, part of the, the atomic transaction and assurance that it happened in the way that it's supposed to happen. It needs to be, sort of selected based on specifically the technologies that are being used and how you would actually get there. There's a lot wrapped up, I think, in your question. One of which might be finality of the transaction, which also is a technology selection question. But today, I think there is a misnomer in the market that we can't do anything successful today because the technology is not ready. So that is a use case selection problem, not a technology problem, right? There are plenty of things that we can do today to actually advance our understanding of how the technology can systemically change what we're doing without having to actually think that, the front to back transaction can't happen because of whatever you want to say it is, right? Whether it's finality or transaction processing speeds or what have you.
If you'll allow me just to make one comment about the Ethereum mainnet. So I think the sort of interesting paradox is that when the internet was built and people, here in Switzerland at CERN were swapping ideas, there wasn't a real-time camera, there wasn't a real-time internet watching the progress or wondering, cool, so when can I send an email? Or like, yeah, that's not useful for me at this point. So I think actually, and I've met with several people at the Ethereum Foundation who say it actually is kind of tough to be able to put timelines out there to say, all right, Ethereum 2.0 is going to be ready in 2020 on this date. And they're trying not to operate like that. And the other part is that since decision-making and building is so decentralized, you have certain people working on one core part of the problem, and then people somewhere else working on it, and then they finally meet each other a year later, and they say, oh, well, actually, I could change this part to, coincide more with what you're building. So there has been, because of Twitter, because of, the constant Medium post updates, people are, urgent and waiting and saying like, okay, when is this going to be this, grand Ethereum network that can scale and is, all public? But I think the reality is that the impatience sometimes, outweighs the actual time to, the people working on it who have to make the tough decisions about scaling and different, consensus mechanisms.
I think that's an extremely important point. Is in 1995, you could never imagine that you could order an Uber, right? Yeah. On a phone. And when we think about the e-commerce stacks and the complexity of the e-commerce stacks and the required transaction processing speeds and things like that, those were not things that we built the internet to do in 1995, right? So that's kind of where we are with blockchain. Right? We cannot imagine what people will do with this technology even 5 years. Right? So while we focus on things that we understand today to achieve perceived limitations in technology stacks, we can't design for what we don't know, right? So we do the best with what we do know.
I did have just a quick thought. I think it's worth elevating from the question. People look sometimes too much at like what's the transaction speed of each of the different blockchain protocols. I think it's really more the end-to-end time of the whole process. So going from like taking 5 days post-trade settlement to doing that in a couple of hours is still a huge improvement versus waiting the 5 days. And of course that the actual transactions per second, which you normally look at transaction processing systems, it's just that moment you're processing it, but you're really looking at the whole end-to-end process that now you're reimagining, either incrementally improving or just, redesigning and then creating, new business models around that as well. But you can already get those benefits now, and there's people sometimes talk about the technical limitations, but it's the whole end-to-end process that's important to look at.
I also think an interesting corollary and problem that you mentioned, which is systemic risk, right, that was introduced into the financial systems because of profit motive. There's certainly an opportunity for us as an industry to create new systemic risk with this new, very capable technology. And I would say, the person that I always refer to who's doing the most advanced guidance on this is Caitlin Long, who has been guiding the Wyoming work. She always talks about rehypothecation, which basically means essentially the systemic risk that we saw in the housing crisis as an example. And people with profit motive will do that, right? And so we need to also make sure that we understand the power of this technology and that we don't allow systemic risk to be reintroduced, with this new technology.
I did want to say, I guess we're probably reaching the end. Sometimes people ask, is blockchain real, enterprise blockchain real? So Souleima was here from Komgo to talk about her experience. I think just from the time aspect, we have another client looking at financial inclusion for the 35 million unbanked Filipinos. It's Union Bank, which Microsoft is involved there too. They actually just in domestic remittances, what they've launched already with their network, have seen going from over 30 days to just, a matter of minutes with some of these processes, and then cutting down like along the way, like 25 steps, and now you're doing 5 steps. So it's already tangible benefits for specific use cases clients are seeing, and it's just the first in a whole roadmap of what they're planning to do with this.
And with each one of those steps, there's money being taken too, so it's
Yep.
like more money at the end of the day for remittances.